All right, Second Chronicles 6, let's once again call this one Turn, but subtitle it Solomon Dedicated, because dedicated is the word that is literally going to come up in chapter 7 when we see God seeming to accept the prayer that Solomon offers up in this chapter, hoping to dedicate the temple to a certain purpose. And so on the occasion of finishing the temple, Solomon once again is going to offer up a prayer similar to what we saw in 1 Kings chapter 8, where he asks God to bless this as a place where people can either turn to rediscover their way or find it for the first time in the first place. Beginning roughly midway through the chapter in verse 22, where it says, if a man sins against his neighbor, let this be a place they can turn to for justice. In verse 24, if your people Israel are defeated before their enemies because they have sinned. It's going to talk about allow this to be a place that they can turn to set their way right. In verse 26, he's going to say, when heaven is shut up and there is no rain because they have sinned. He's going to say, once again, let this be a place that they can turn to. And then collectively, if it's something that's more indescript, they don't necessarily know what's going on, but things are going wrong, he's going to say, let this be a place that they can pray towards, so that in verse 30, then hear from heaven your dwelling place and forgive, indicating once again that these are situations that if you go back to Deuteronomy, the blessings and the curses, these curses would have never happened if not for a sin. And so he's asking God to make this a place they can turn to and find forgiveness and relief from their unnecessary suffering. But that's not going to be the only thing, because in verse 32, he's going to say, likewise, when a foreigner turns toward this place, having nothing to do with his sin, because even today, we don't all have the same starting point. Some of us are planted in environments where we struggle to understand from the very beginning what is right and wrong, whereas others are born in environments where from a very early age, you have a clear understanding of what is right and what is wrong and what is fair, understanding the way in which you want to be treated is the way in which you need to treat other folks. Not everybody has that start. And so likewise, he seems to be asking God to make this a refuge for people who are seeking because they are exhausted with where they've come from, a place where basic morality, ethics, and integrity were confusing quite possibly from the day they were born. And then he's going to go on to say in verse 34, if your people go out to battle against their enemies, by whatever way you shall send them, and they pray to you toward this city. Once again, not necessarily having anything to do with their sins, but understanding there was a time when even David, going out against the Philistines on the heels of one victory, consulted God to make sure, am I going out the right way this time? And God said, no. You're going out for the right purpose, fighting the Philistines, but this time I want you to flank them around the balsam trees so that I will go out ahead of you to save you from the need for unnecessary struggle. So finally, it's going to go back to the collective sins of the people in verse 36, where it says, if they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin. He's going to talk about degrees this time. It's not just smaller sins where they're in an occasional temporary period of confusion. This is the time when he is taking them off into captivity. He is going to ask God to allow this to be a point of refuge or a point of reference for his people, even after they've been carried off into exile, which reminded me that going back to the blessings and the curses of Deuteronomy and forward to the next chapter, chapter 7, God is going to accept Solomon's prayer of dedication on the condition that if they turn from the purpose for which he is dedicating it, once again, making it a reference point for people who are trying to find their way back or simply trying to find their way to God for the first time, then he is going to knock it down, because it's not simply going to be a place of honor for Israel if it's not a place of refuge for everyone in Israel and throughout the entire world alike. Something similar to what we're going to see in Jesus' actual ministry as he enters the temple at one point saying, look, God's house was supposed to be a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of thieves. Jesus using the misuse of the temple in his day to remind us in many ways of what we'll see in the next chapter, chapter 7, when God tells them that they need to make sure they stay focused on making the temple a refuge for everyone. But even at Israel's worst, God promised to preserve a remnant of people he would call back to Jerusalem to once again set an example of what healthy relationships look like, something the author of 1 John is going to call the way they treated one another, and likewise how their relationships with one another reflected their true attitude toward God. And so in a time when I seem to see more and more articles and more preachers discussing the apparent decline in interest in God, God's best to every remnant out there in the church that is still providing legitimate refuge to people who seem to be growing more and more exhausted with all the effort they're putting into forming relationships with people they're not sure they can actually trust.